to. I just want to thank everyone for joining us at our first roundtable discussion of honoring our histories and stories. My name is Adrienne Billings-Smith. I am the equity coordinator for the town of West Hartford. Tonight's discussion is in honor of Native American Heritage Month. I'd like to take a moment and thank the roundtable participants in advance for being a part of this, and I would also like to thank the Indigenous Recognition and Reconciliation Task Force. The Indigenous Recognition and Reconciliation Task Force is committed to supporting and creating pathways to better educate the community about the importance of Indigenous history and culture in West Hartford and the greater Hartford area through a series of gatherings, intercultural dialogue, storytelling workshops, public education, and cultural and arts programs, with the purpose of officially recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day, developing a land acknowledgement statement, and providing sustainable objectives and recommendations to support Indigenous peoples and Indigenous cultures. Further, the task force focus is on building a more respectful and compassionate community, mending past transgressions, building shared understanding, and creating a legacy for meaningful change in our community. Again, thank you for joining us, and I will pass the mic over to our moderator, Stephen Pevar. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stephen Pevar, and I am the moderator this evening. I'm joined by 5 presenters, each of whom will identify themselves and participate in our discussions. November is Native American Heritage Month. Tonight's session seeks to commemorate and celebrate the heritage of Native Americans. And we hope this session will be one of many and not limited to November. This should be an ongoing process of community education. 4 years ago, the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, which is the largest organization of American Indian tribes in the country, published a 51-page report entitled Becoming Visible. The report pointed out the shameful fact, in my opinion, that most public school systems in this country teach nothing about Native American history, culture, or religion, apart from a few mentioning Thanksgiving. And it's as if Native Americans fed some starving pilgrims and then vanished into thin air. Little is known by the general public about the 400 treaties that the United States entered into with the indigenous nations, nor about the reservation system, nor about the boarding schools, nor about the contributions that American Indian tribes and their members have made to our society. West Hartford wants to change that in this community. A committee was formed of interested persons, and we've held a number of meetings. This session is one outcome, which the town council strongly supports. And I want to thank Adrienne Billings-Smith, our staff coordinator, for her assistance throughout this entire process. There were hundreds of topics that we could have chosen for this first session. We selected the one that you'll hear tonight. What does it mean to be Native or Indigenous in America? All 5 presenters are Native American. They will each answer that question in their own way. There are 3 things I'd like to mention at the outset by way of introduction. First, the names Native American, American Indian, and Indian are often used interchangeably. Some people have strong preferences for one over another. Native American is becoming increasingly popular. However, as I just mentioned, the largest tribal organization in the country is called the National Congress of American Indians. And many tribes have the word Indian in their titles. For instance, the Narragansett Indian tribe in Rhode Island, the Pawnee Indian tribe in Oklahoma. You may hear all three tonight. Second, there is also no universally accepted definition of Indian tribe or American Indian or Native American tribe. In 1978, the federal government created a system to officially recognize a group as an Indian tribe. It's a very controversial process. Since then, the federal government has recognized 574 groups as being Indian tribes. But some 200 tribes are still seeking recognition. The state of Connecticut, for instance, officially recognized 5 tribes, only 2 of which are federally recognized. So federal recognition is a white colonial concept, not a Native American concept. Lastly, I am the moderator. I'm not Indigenous. I'm a white guy. But I have some familiarity with federal Indian law. That is, the federal laws, the treaties, the regulations that apply to Native Americans. After graduating from law school, I took a job with legal aid on the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation in South Dakota. And I lived and worked there for almost 4 years. After that, I took a job with the American Civil Liberties Union. And in that capacity, I represented a number of Indian tribes and tribal members in lawsuits around the United States. I also have written about federal Indian law, and currently I teach advanced federal Indian law at Yale Law School. I live here in West Hartford. With that as an introduction, I want to turn everything over to the presenters. Each presenter has been asked to explain what it means to him or her to be Indigenous, but they are free to discuss any and all topics that they wish. The answer to that probing question isn't necessarily easy. If I were to ask any of us to tell us what it means to be white or black or Asian or Hispanic, I'm sure it would require, as it certainly would myself, a great deal of soul searching. I want to thank every member of the panel who has done that soul searching and is here to offer their experience and knowledge and feelings with us tonight. So we will view this as a roundtable discussion. The first question for us to consider is the title of the presentation. What does it mean to be Native or Indigenous in the United States? And whoever would like to discuss that. And you could introduce yourselves, please, as you do.
Sure. Well, everyone, those of you who don't know me, my name is Mixashawn Rozie, and I'm of MayikiNiska, Mohawk, and Cherokee descent. My dad comes from a community that became known as the Windsor Indians in the Quantico or Windsor. But we're not federally recognized or recognized by the state. And what it means to be Indigenous to me, I'd like to make it more local here in Quantico, or some people say Quantucket, let the scholars fight that out. But being Indigenous here, you had mentioned, earlier, Connecticut has 5 recognized tribes and 2 are federally recognized. But Connecticut's also a place where they de-recognize people, because the Eastern Pequot tribe, not the Mashantuckets, the people on the other side of the lake, they got recognized about, I forget, it was a number of years ago. But it only lasted for about a year and a half or so, and there was such a backlash from the local community, such hatred, because just to be quite honest with you, most Indian communities are oftentimes surrounded by a hostile white community, not just here in CT, but all over the country. So due to that de-recognition, here in Connecticut, we have, we think about things a little more closely than other places, because Connecticut has always been the testing ground for the colonial powers that be to do what they do. For instance, here in Connecticut, we were the last to be colonized after New York and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And because geographically where we sit, that made colonization a lot harder. So when they came into Connecticut, it was the first time that the colonists came on a war footing. Because if you check your history, you know that the Pequot War started the same time when they started to, English settlers started coming in here with Thomas Hooker and all those folks. So what it means to be indigenous, it means to come from a community, know where you come from, know what's around you, understand and live, you know, as best as you can by the land, and eat things that are grown locally. And there's lots of things, but being indigenous to me does not mean a plastic ID card.
I can go next. When you asked that question, and even when we were preparing for this meeting, like my whole life flashes before my eyes. It's like all my life, and my mother's life, and my grandmother's life. So I'm Cassandra Toscano, and I'm descended from the Kootenai Indians out of British Columbia, the corner of British Columbia, Alberta, Idaho, Montana. And so we had extra complications because we crossed an international border and also state borders. And so I agree with you, and my family agrees, that the most important thing about identification is self-identification. Whether or not you identify as Indigenous or Native American, even within your own family, I think there's different experiences and feelings about whether or not, people feel ready to embrace their heritage. And we can talk more about that later. In my family, my grandma is a survivor of the Indian residential school in Cranbrook, British Columbia, and that put decades on hold of whether or not we talk about, what do we talk about in our Native American history that's not going to upset grandma, and what do we do? Can we contact the tribe if she doesn't contact the tribe, if mom doesn't? All of that's connected. And so, I think it's just a matter of whether you have self-identification with the values that you're taught, and then preserving all the traditions, the cultures that you're taught, and then keeping a curiosity about it, along the way. There's been such a destruction of the culture and a planned assimilation of our tribes over the years that I think that keeping that curiosity and that interest and encouraging it in each other, encouraging it in allies, and encouraging it in our own families is also what's I identify as being part of being Native American at this time, is to continue to preserve that culture and be a caretaker for it.
I can go next. The mic is still on. Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm Sage Phillips. I'm a very proud citizen of the Penobscot Nation. Our traditional homelands are in what we currently refer to as the state of Maine. We're also the Wabanaki people, or the people of the Dawnland. I'm a current graduate student at the University of Connecticut, but for me, I think the terminology question is really big. I come from a family where my grandfather, he will say till the day he dies, I'm a Penobscot Indian, and that word Indian just makes me want to cringe. We don't argue about it, we don't fight about it, because we all have our preferences. I, however, first and foremost, always just want to be recognized by my community and where I came from, which is Penobscot. And I think when somebody takes the time to ask me, what's your tribe? That's like my biggest sign of respect, because it shows that they have good intentions to care and they want to learn about where you come from. Aside from that, I prefer Native or Indigenous. You'll never really see me using Native American or Indian, not that they're wrong, we all have our own preferences. But I just hear those terms and I think, ties to colonization, and it doesn't really sit well with me. Something that you said, though, I was thinking about too, for me, what it means to be Indigenous. I feel like I'm on this path to reclamation and reclaiming my indigeneity and my Penobscot identity. But whenever somebody asks me what it means to be Indigenous, I always just think community. And whenever I have those questions of uncertainty about myself, I always just go back to my community and, speak with my elders, speak with our tribal leadership. And I think that is who we are at our core, that we recognize that community is, they raised us, they care for us, and that's just how our communities operate. I never really do anything for, myself or to get self-recognition. I always want to, I lead and I try to make change and do better, but it's for my community that I currently work in, it's for my community back home, but it's also for all of our communities too. So for me, yeah, I still have times where, I'm sure we'll talk about some stereotypes and other things we face and maybe some struggles, but there are still days where I kind of look in the mirror and I'm like, I think I'm still figuring this out a little bit. And that's okay. And, my community and my elders tell me it's okay, because we did have times where I also had family members who were impacted by the residential schools. And you're absolutely right. There was a time where it made it hard for us to have these conversations, but it's great to be here tonight and be with others who get it, and we can talk about that and feel safe and comfortable.
I'm Bevin Rainwater. I'm from the Cherokee and Choctaw tribes myself, but a displaced member. So my grandparents moved from Oklahoma. My family was originally on the Trail of Tears and was placed in Oklahoma by the federal government. And my grandparents during the Dust Bowl era moved to California for a better life, and to escape a lot of the racism and problems that were present in Oklahoma at the time. And my grandmother would very much refuse to acknowledge any kind of Native American roots because she didn't want to be labeled as Native American. My grandfather, however, would pass that down to my mother, and my mother and my great-grandmother would make sure that that tradition was alive in our family. So community for me isn't necessarily where I'm at, but it's like how I'm present in the world around me. So recognizing my traditions and my family, respect is number one, respect for myself, for other people, for the environment around me, for the language, the culture, and whatever it is religiously that you practice. And keeping that alive as much as I can. I wish my son, who is 17, were more interested in his Native roots, but maybe one day that's a path that each of us has to follow. But my grandfather, he also did not believe in that piece of plastic or that piece of paper that tells you you're a Native American or Indian. And he did use Indian as well. I use Native American or Native or Indigenous myself. He didn't believe that it defined who you are, that you are a tribal member, because he refused to get it. His mother was full-blooded Cherokee, and when her husband passed away, she got sent back to the reservation. They controlled your whole life, where you went to school, what you were allowed to do, what practices you were allowed to practice. You couldn't do your Native traditions and your dances and your music and stuff, or you could be arrested or worse, and it was just horrible. And so he was always imparted upon us, do not register for that BIA number because then they control your life. And he didn't want us to be defined by a piece of plastic from the federal government. So it all is the spectrum of, how you live your life. One thing about the Native Americans too is it's not, and Cherokee in particular, it's not blood quantum necessarily. A lot of Cherokees adopted people who were not Native American themselves, but who were community practitioners. Even some slaves were adopted into the Cherokee tradition. So there's a lot of African Americans as well that were labeled as Cherokee too.
Hello, I'm Mikey PLO. I'm Lumbee, Halawasaponian Crow, and for the question, knowing who you what to be Native American is.
Yes, for you, what does it mean?
it's kind of a hard question, but like I guess we're all kind of trying to figure out like what it means to us, and being Native American to me is like being around like just like our families and like elders and like just like listening to like history that they talk about, and then also like going to like events also like in like embracing our traditions that are still around but like evolving in art, because I'm into art. I'm an art student at Hartford University, and I just love art, and it's like that's how I've embraced my culture, I guess. Yeah.
And just to follow up with you, I know that you're a dancer at powwows. Maybe you could share with us why.
Well, I've been brought up into powwows ever since I was a baby. My mom, she would like have me. That's like how it is for like a lot of like families. They'll bring their babies into like the like culture and like powwows, and like they'll start dancing and like start having like outfits made for them, and like they figure out what they like to dance or like want to dance, and then they get into it and they just start dancing. And yeah, I've been doing it like all my life. I really love dancing.
Yeah. And how do you feel when you're dancing?
It's hard. It's like a sport kind of. You gotta like be dedicated to it. You gotta like practice, especially for like fancy dancing, because it takes a lot of endurance kind of. Yeah, and it takes like a lot of practice of like footwork and all that, and yeah, and I got taught like from a lot of family members and like seeing other fancy dancers dance in like the arena and stuff.
And Bevin, I don't know if this is what went on in your family, but I do know from being involved in discussions like this that there's quite a few elders who were afraid to pass on culture because those were the people who were punished. Mm-hmm. Those were the people who were taken and placed in boarding schools or sent back, and they were afraid to have their children learn about it or learn their language because they thought that they would be punished. Again, I'm not saying that that's your family, I don't know, but I've heard it time and time again.
I think it was true of my grandmother. I think it was true of my grandmother's side of the family. My maternal grandmother, my paternal grandmother, great grandmother. She was the one who carried the traditions on in my family, and my paternal grandmother. She passed away when I was young, so she didn't really have the opportunity to do so either. But my maternal grandmother, she was Choctaw, and she just pretty much, shut it all down. But my grandfather, on the side, when my grandmother wasn't around, was keeping those traditions still alive with my mom. So that was great.
I wanted to also echo, just go on to the card again, because this is so much about, this, what is not identity. I would say there's such an allergy to that.
Well, it goes, not just an allergy, but for instance, it goes beyond just, stating that you're Native American or being on a reservation because, for instance, the National Congress of American Indians, there was, I believe it was last week, they were voting whether or not they're going to strip the rights of state-recognized tribes as opposed to only having federally recognized tribes vote in their own, caucus. So there's a lot of, I won't say disagreement, but there's a lot of different opinions about how people go about this. And part of it is a confusion. We all know what the Native American art form is, don't we? Defined by the United States government.
I don't.
It's called JAZZ.
No.
Yeah, that's a fact. And that's part of the whole problem. This one reason why, there's so many people believe fake news, because they give us so many lies, they can't keep up with all the lies. So, and that term Native American, all it means is that someone who was born in the Americas. Doesn't mean anything more than that.
Yeah.
Now, people put other meaning to it. And when you talk about being indigenous, that's a different thing. But just the terms itself, it's all meant to be nebulous. And what you were saying about control, that is the reason, I believe that's the reason why the majority of Native people never were on reservations. Mm-hmm. We go back and forth through reservations. We have relations, of course, with the people. But if we believe that only Native people who are Native here in this hemisphere are on reservations, we're discarding millions throughout the hemisphere. I try not to think of it just in the United States.
I think it's a good point, and I was just going to say my grandma too, when she finally went and got a card, and I don't know if it's different in Canada versus the United States, hers had an expiration date of 5 years. And she was so mad because she hates going to any government to be validated that she's Native, and she was like, my mother and father aren't going to change in 5 years. And so she had two really good sayings, and she was Indian, and then she would say, it's never benefited me for anyone else to know that I'm Indian. It's only benefited me for me to know that I'm Indian. Mm-hmm. And I think that echoes what you were saying too.
Self-worth.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I get the expiration date thing because it doesn't make sense for it to expire because we never stop being Native.
Yeah, and
it's not like a license.
The Dawes roll too. So the Dawes roll from the time of the Trail of Tears was so vastly inaccurate. So many people were claiming to be other just so they weren't discriminated against.
Of course.
Yeah.
Right.
And even the government too, it's in our classrooms. The government too, it's in our classrooms. Even I speak to young children sometimes, and one of the questions it inevitably comes is, well, what percentage? And I'm like, I'm not going to tell you that. And, you have to, especially with kids, to be gentle and, explain. But it's a teaching moment, right? Most of the time, they just don't know any better. It's when it's with the adults in the room that I'm, it's just that's not how I'm going to identify myself.
You brought up a perfect thing. What percentage of you? We have to understand that Adolf Hitler studied the way that Native Americans were classified, and the Jim Crow laws and the laws passed for Native Americans to create what he did in Europe and that great genocide that went on there. So we have to understand, these are, people say that all the time, what percentage of you? And yet at the same time, people don't even know what a race is or what it's defined as, because there's only one race, the human race. But you'll get people, I work with kids a lot, and that people ask, what race are you? I say, well, I'm Polish. Oh, okay. Or Mexican. I'm Jamaican. It's like people don't understand, and because we have all these different categories that are put on us by the colonial mind, that we're just lost in confusion, fight and getting mad at each other over these titles. Mm-hmm. For instance, in my case, I've been on the Connecticut Commission on the Arts, New England Foundation for the Arts for years, almost 40 years as a Native person, and done a lot of work with Native people, non-Native people, but representing that. And just this past May, I suddenly got a letter say, oh, we can no longer list you as a Native American. That is good. This goes with the expiration date what you were talking about. And what is the purpose of that? We have to understand there's a purpose for it. There's a reason for that. And there's a reason why, there was a vote coming in the National Congress of American Indians whether they should strip people of their voting rights. Right now we're at a time when they're trying to genocide us through paper, trying to genocide us, which goes right back to here in New England. What was the biggest non-violent genocide they did? The last of the Mohicans. That is that whole purpose of that really is genocidal, because all it talks about is, these people, they're on their way out, and we fall right into it because I am the last. Why be the last? Who wants to be the last? That's sad. So you just made me think of that.
Yeah, and going off of that, a lot of kids that from might have been middle school or high school, I don't remember, but a lot of kids thought that there weren't any Native Americans at all. They thought that the schools had taught them that they didn't say specifically that they got wiped out, but they made it seem like we were gone, but we're still here.
Well, shame you. Just like recognized, non-recognized. What does that mean? It's like Hartford is a majority minority city. What in the H does that mean? It means you're less than, and let's just continue to just say it as matter-of-factly as we can, so it just becomes common to, oh yeah, I'm lesser than.
You've already started doing what I was going to suggest next, and that is, as I mentioned, there's very few public schools teach anything about Native American heritage. And we have an opportunity here to inform people. What are some of the things you would like people to know about Native Americans?
One thing you have to realize is that Connecticut actually has a resolution right now for the K through 12 schools to redo the curriculum and to reintroduce Native American history and culture into the curriculum. So that is something that's being put into schools now to help turn that around a little bit. So I think that's great. But I think, it's really grassroots right now, and I think it needs to spread across the country because I get it all the time. I mean, I spoke to a class a couple weeks ago at the university on Native Americans and Indigenous people and gender, and they asked so many questions, and most people just, even in college, don't realize anything about Native Americans at all. It's just really kind of sad that they had no idea anything. We need to be more vocal, we need to make ourselves known, stand up for who we are, be proud of who we are, and make that, visible as possible.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that Connecticut is considering this because in the report, Becoming Visible, NCAI mentions that 87% of the states in the United States don't have any standards whatsoever requiring the teaching of Native American history in the public schools. 87%. And that's why I said it's just shameful. I mean, it's hard to understand why they wouldn't require it.
Well, it's the time we're living in. Look what's happening in many parts of the country. They're banning the teaching of Black history.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an attitude, and not teaching about Native people. That's just that's a foregone conclusion. It's, oh yeah, what? You know what I mean? So we have to face the fact that we're living in a time, we tend to look at things like what happened in the past. The same thing is happening now. It's just use different tools, that's all.
Yeah, you were asking what we want to bring awareness to, and I'm very passionate about the residential schools and the harm that has brought to our family systems in the Native community. And I would encourage anyone to read the report that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in Canada. Our Indian residential school here in the U.S. Went on for 150 years. In the first 50 years, it was so successful, we imported it to Canada. It went on for 100 years in Canada. But they started their Truth and Reconciliation first, and they went through discovery with their First Nation tribes and to look at all of the physical, sexual, all the deaths that occurred under that system. And so it's a monumental report. And then from that report, they're still working on, last summer they were sonaring the ground, for the unmarked graves at all of the schools. My grandma's school was one of those schools. There were 182 children's bodies in the backyard of the school unmarked. The children were used for forced labor. The report says the sexual abuse that occurred in the schools was uncountable. And you can't imagine, and put yourself in the shoes of these kids going into these schools, things that go on for 100 years or 150 years. Your parents went to that school, and then you have to hand over your 5-year-old child to your perpetrators at 5 years old, every single one of your kids. That's the law. And, you know, I can't imagine doing that or having the police come and take the kids at age 5 and put them into the schools. So just the horror stories that have come out of that, and then the trauma, you know, that has happened on the family systems from that. Deb Haaland here in the United States, you know, as she's just starting this process here, it's about a 10 or 15 year process. We'll see who's president next, if it even continues, right? She just finished last week her first listening tour, right? And to the tribes who are most affected. When she kicked it off, she said a couple things. One was, it was documented in Congress, the reason why they did the residential schools in the United States was that it was cheaper than war to get the land back that they gave for reservations. And it was cheaper than war to decimate and assimilate the families to get the land back. So it was a plan, like you're saying, everything has a purpose. It was an outright, fully transparent plan that people voted on. They were going to go decimate families. I mean, I can't even imagine this. And so then, you know, and then she also said the other thing, when we're done with our investigation here in the US, read the Canadian report, expect double here, because it was bigger and it happened longer. So there's still so much more reconciliation and discovery. I still think we're very much, how you were saying, like we're all kind of uncovering, you know, our own journey. I think it's because there is an awakening in this generation, and in previous generations it's coming to a boil. We're talking to each other, you know, and I think that I'm hoping for a bigger reconciliation and bigger discussion, and that we finish this reconciliation committee and try to figure out how and try to ascertain how much damage was done. And then you have to add on top of that the 60s scoop, where they put, you know, 35 to 40% of all Indigenous children into white foster homes. Mm-hmm. So you're saying there's new tools now? There may not be Indigenous, you know, Indian residential schools now. There's foster care. You're 4 times more likely to be in foster care than a white person if you're Indigenous. And so it's the same family system, you know, sort of disassimilation, so that you're fragmented from your family. So you don't have people to talk to. You don't have strong family systems. There's intergenerational trauma, and then there's shame, all tied up in that, and that's all in the identity too. And instead of helping families that have had purposeful trauma done to them, we're continuing to separate them. It's still happening today, and it's still purposeful today.
That's the origins of integration.
Mm-hmm. Just to add a few statistics, one of the cases that I filed was against the Social Services Department in South Dakota, and Native children were 16 times more likely to go into foster care. 16 times. They were just under 9% of the population of South Dakota, and they were 52% of the children in foster care. I also want to talk about some statistics about the boarding schools. As you mentioned, Deb Haaland, finally, she's our Secretary of the Interior, the first Native American woman to hold such a high position. And she commissioned a study, and it was released last year. There were some 200 boarding schools, and they were financed by the federal government. Upwards of 1 million Native children were essentially kidnapped from their homes and placed into these boarding schools. And you know, it's notorious what happened there, like you had said. And they were all over the country. The largest or most well-known is the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and it was run by a Civil War officer named Pratt. And Pratt is the guy who infamously said that the purpose of the school was to kill the Indian and save the man, and to rub out Native culture and have these children become white people. And there are hundreds of graves there too. Unless someone else would want to speak on that topic, another question that I had was, what are some changes that you might like to suggest or see in our society? But I hope I didn't cut you off. Did you want to talk about what we had been discussing? Okay, I thought that you had.
I wanted to
Oh,
mention one more
please,
thing.
please.
I think another topic that needs to be brought into light in this country, especially throughout areas that have larger reservation areas, Southwest, particularly in the Midwest, is the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement, because 4 out of 5 women and children in Native communities have been abused or raped, and many of them go missing, and it's so much more than any other minority group or even white people group in this country. It's just kind of crazy, and they just don't seem to do anything about it. You know, the federal government and local governments will tell you, oh, that's a tribal thing, but the tribal governments don't have the resources, or it happens just off the tribe, so there's nothing the tribal government can do, and the tribal governments have no jurisdiction over the perpetrators of the crime, which often happen to be of the majority, white people. And so it's just really tough. You know, what do you do? It's kind of a catch-22. And, you know, a lot of people have not been recovered. A lot of women and children have not been recovered. They just disappear into the ether, and nobody seems to know what happens to them. So I think that's another thing that needs to be brought into bigger perspective.
And to give some sad statistics, Native women are 10 times more likely to be murdered and 2.5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than women elsewhere. In 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court held that Indian tribes don't have the authority to arrest and prosecute these non-Indian lawbreakers. As you mentioned, the vast majority of perpetrators of sexual assault on Native women are non-Indians, and yet the Supreme Court has stripped them of the ability to arrest and prosecute these non-Indians. Fortunately, Congress has passed a small law, an amendment to the Violence Against Women Act that restores some of that authority, but it's still very narrow.
Yeah, I just want to connect the dot here to one of the stereotypes about Indigenous people, which is substance abuse and alcoholism. Yeah. And, you know, underneath substance use disorders, there's often trauma, right? And so if there are substance use needs in a community, the first thing you need to look at is the need for traumatic events, whether they're community-wide, intergenerational, you know, a whole community can be traumatized, and we are. And then individuals can have their own individual trauma. Tribes often don't have, enough resources. And I do want to go back to what you said, because 60% of Native people do not live on a reservation.
Oh, yeah, sure.
60%.
Yeah.
So, we live everywhere. We're everywhere. We're not on a reservation, so we're not all covered by the IHS, which is mainly for, reservations and things like that. We're everywhere. We're covered by all sorts of different kinds of
And IHS
insurance.
for those, Indian Health Service.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And which is only for federally recognized tribes anyways, and reservations. And so so I think that there is always a stereotype there, but if you did actually care about that, you should look at the massive amounts of trauma, all the statistics you were just reading off. You would put resources towards that and address the trauma.
Yeah, and part of that is even just like recognition. Like, for instance, in general, when you get out west, I've lived in the Midwest, and there's huge racism for Indian people out there. It's huge, and for people who are not white. Period. I remember one time I woke up in the morning, I read the newspaper, and they moved the entire Mexican population out of a town in Minnesota. They just wiped it out because they didn't need them anymore, so they just kicked the people out. So what I'm getting at is like every week I see at least 2 to 3 women who are missing right here in the Hartford area, just in Hartford. And all of them, like 99% of them, are not white. And it's interesting because some of them are black, a lot of them are what we call Hispanic. And it's interesting when they'll say the race, that oftentimes they'll say that they're white. And I mean, they look just like me, it could be my sister. And it's just interesting. So it's classification, not only on how the government does it, but how we internalize it. And, missing, violence against women is bad across the board, and especially people of color. But out in the Midwest and those other places like the South, it really falls on Indian people, huge. But here, it falls on everybody here. If you're not, because the fact is, young white girls don't disappear on the same level that women of color do, just right here.
If I can go back to the education question, I think to answer that, I oftentimes reflect on my own education in a predominantly white school, in a predominantly white town with our reservation just down the road, and at a school that was formerly known as the Indians. That was the mascot. And that was gone way before I entered school, but it was still there. Still faced the negative repercussions that mascots like that have. And I just remember what I learned at the dinner table versus what I learned in the classroom being complete opposite things. In the classroom, it was always negative. It was the Trail of Tears, it was Christopher Columbus, but it felt like it was taught, like, glorified. And that, you go home and you tell your parents what you learned, and just not great. And so I'm thankful to have had those conversations at the dinner table where I was actually able to learn about my culture. Not saying that we shouldn't be learning about all cultures, but that was awesome. And I say all this to get to the point of we absolutely need the next generation of students and even adults, but we need the next generation of students in the classroom to be learning about absolutely the genocide and the traumas. But we also need to learn about the positives. Like,
Thank you.
we have art and we have tradition and we have community. And to not really see my culture in the classroom, given where my classroom was located in that close of proximity to my people, was really harmful. I think at the time I just kind of went with the flow, wanted to blend in, find some friends, and that was, being proudly Penobscot wasn't always the way to do that. And as a kid in a classroom, what do you, as the one Penobscot kid in the classroom, what are you going to say? But there's so many positives in, like, dancing, like, let's watch Mayiki dance in the classroom, There's so many great things to be teaching, and if we teach our if our histories are just all continuously taught as a negative thing, what's that going to do for us?
Well, just like, I think Rolling Thunder, the elder out in Nevada, he summed it up. They asked him, he says, what do you like best about this country? And he said, everything the white man stole. And instead of saying, the massacres and the Indian over on the horse leaning down, this culture, so much of this culture, I mean, half the language that we use in places that we have, it comes from native languages. How many native people, like Jimi Hendrix was Cherokee and black. I mean, how important was he? You know what I'm saying? And he's just one of many. Native people have done so much to uplift this country, and we got to flip that narrative, That's why, honestly, I haven't seen that movie about, the Osage, killers of the, I don't want to see it. I'm sure it's very truthful and all, but I don't, it's just going to give me high blood pressure, make me angry. Just being honest.
Yeah.
And I think that since that they only teach the bad parts of the things that happen to Native people, I kind of feel that's what makes them lose sight of that natives are actually still alive. That's what makes people think that we're dead or extinct or something, because they never really teach the now what we're alive and what our tribe's doing and powwows and dancing and art and stuff. Yeah, they could be teaching a lot more than they do.
Yeah, I'm surprised and thankful that you're even talking to us. I think of, let's say that, heaven forbid, the Russians succeed in overrunning Ukraine. I can't imagine the people of Ukraine embracing the Russians or trusting them. And yet that's basically what happened here to the native peoples. And we stole native land and dominated the indigenous people. And if people look at us suspiciously, of course. How could we white people not expect that? And if we are lucky enough to have native people want to be friends, then it's very fortunate for us, the way I look at it.
How can we focus white guilt for the benefit of all of us?
Yeah. So we have talked about many bad things and negative things. Have you seen any progress?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of
A little bit. I think there's been a huge shift in the past. I was talking with Judy about this earlier today, about 7 to 10 years, a large reawakening, and it's like a momentum, especially since COVID. And, the Native Americans in this country and Indigenous people in this country and in Canada are monopolizing ways to get information out there via the web, and building beautiful websites to showcase their language, showcase their culture, and all these things. I'm on a couple YouTube subscriptions, like the Cherokee Word of the Day or the Ojibwe Word of the Day, and it's great that there's a reawakening of that thing, and a way for children also to learn their roots. Maybe they don't have that connection to their elders in that place. For example, my family isn't, I have some in Oklahoma, but I have no real connection to some of those cousins really anymore. But I'm learning Cherokee Words of the Day via YouTube, which is awesome, So I think, as people in our culture put things out there, hopefully we could become more and more visible in positive ways, not just the negative ways.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have, our Kootenai people, there's only, I don't know who they're counting, but when they publish numbers, there's only 1,500 or so in the tribe right now. And, but the digital helps. And so you can take, Kootenai language lessons there's 12 native language speakers, and so they are capturing all of that now and teaching, and it is growing, there's definitely growing. My 92-year-old grandmother gets on Zoom and teaches my kids about brain tanning when she was a child growing up, and they're like, what are you talking about, brain tanning? The deer hide.
Right.
And so, I think there is something about that. I don't know if it was the pandemic, but I do think the technological revolution. I also think because we've been so in different tribes, I always was jealous sometimes of other minority groups that they had a bigger umbrella or something like that. It's hard sometimes to pull us all together because we're so proud of our individual, heritage. So I feel like maybe we're coming together in a more unified voice. Maybe I'm just me coming to that understanding, but I'm hoping that we can do more together.
I think that's happening. 'Cause you're seeing people across the board identifying as Indigenous across a wide spectrum. Like, for instance, I worked for the census one year, and, they ask you the questions, like they said Hispanic. Now, Hispanic's the only group that they say, well, are you white Hispanic? Are you a black Hispanic? But they don't say, are you an indigenous Hispanic? And there's a lot of indigenous Hispanic people. Lots and lots. So, again, it gets down to, I really do think that there is a consciousness that's happening. But we have to be careful of. I just saw on Channel 30 the other night, like Friday night, they were showing some positive things, about, what's happening with Native people. But then they had a list up there, and they said the 5 biggest tribes in Connecticut. And they named the Mashantuckets, the Eastern Pequots, the Mohicans. They didn't mention Golden Hill. They didn't mention the Scotticos. They even mentioned the Narragansetts. And then they had these numbers, well, there's 500 Narragansetts here. It's probably a lot more than that. How many Wampanoags here? They didn't say anything about that. So the point of what I'm saying, while this consciousness is expanding, we don't want it to be co-opted. Just like the 60s, because I'm old enough to remember how they co-opt things, like Right On, that you could see that like in Afro picks and, and hippie wigs. They have all kinds of ways of, co-opting what we're doing. So that's the danger we have to watch out for, because it's omnipresent.
I think also our time might be coming with the climate crisis, because there's a way that, and that I grew up with thinking about the earth and thinking about animals and naming animals in a certain way, just thinking of them as a little bit more familial, think about the earth as a little more familial than I see in other people that are close to me. And it's very hard to describe to people in that nuanced way if they didn't grow up with it. But I do think with the climate crisis, our time might be coming just in terms of, you might not want to chop down that tree if it has a name, if that is your friend, you might not. I think there's something there in personalizing the earth to take care of it.
Respecting the earth and environment is a major thing in Native American cultures that isn't present in mainstream white culture at all. For them, land is to be conquered and to be used and capitalized on as much as possible. In Native cultures, we share in stewardship of the land and work in partnership with the land and waterways. It's completely different.
That reminds me of like an issue that happened like a few years ago. The Dakota Access Pipeline that happened. Like we're trying to like protect the water, and like pipeline happened, and I think they still went through with it, but something that could like be like improved on in the future is like preserving like the environment and like cutting back on like pipelines and things like that. Make cleaner water.
Have more land access, a lot more. Here in West Hartford and a few of the towns around here, they're starting to open up land access, but I think that needs to be expanded much more. And believe it or not, they need to expand bicycle lanes so people can actually use them, not just for recreation, but they can get back and forth if you don't have a car.
An important statistics, I seem to be adding statistics, to what you had just said. In the 2010 census, and the way the census works is that they just ask you what ethnicity or race you are, and they just write down whatever you say. And in the 2010 census, there were about 4.5 million who identified as Native American or Alaska Native. And in the 2020, there were almost 10 million. So the Native pride issue that you had mentioned, there's many more people who are recognizing their heritage and proud of it.
I think it's definitely true of the younger generation. My parents' generation and my grandparents' generation may not have been as open about being Native American because the abject racism in this country, and try to, downplay those roots so they weren't prejudiced against.
It wasn't cool back in the day.
It wasn't cool. And, and Native Americans up until 1978 or so didn't have civil rights in this country. They didn't have the right to vote or any of that. So, it's just a completely different thing. And this younger generation, they are more accepting of who they are and who cares what anybody else thinks. And it's awesome. I love it.
Let me just take a moment and see if there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question.
I would like to ask a question. Up until today, it's the first time I hear about the cards, so I would like to get a better understanding of what you're referring to.
So, when you register with the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, they give you a registration card. It's like a driver's license, and it does expire. And you have to prove that you're Native American to them every single time that you get this card. And it's like your recognition for that, being in that tribe, being, an actual Native American in this country. And there's many people who are Native American who say, I'm not going to do that.
Oh no, it's funny because you say that. I'm sure you're all aware of that show, Survivor. And whenever they want to kick somebody out of the tribe, what do? They send them to the tribal council, and that's what the tribal council does. Oh, well, you're not an Indian. Oh, you got to get out. So I'm not saying all tribal councils do that, but it does tend to. It's like there's a whole. There's just a whole infrastructure that supports that, and it's. I think we have to get away from that, and we are, in a certain extent.
Yeah, and like for like the cards thing, like, I mean, I have to like for like my card, like I need to get mine renewed because like I haven't done that like in a long time because like my tribe is the one that like I'm federally recognized in is Crow, and it's in Montana. It's where my father lives. And I'll have to move. I have to like fly over there to get like it renewed. So like, yeah, I'll have to do that eventually. But like, I don't really. I mean, it doesn't really prove anything really. Well, for me, like in my identity, but
it proves that they're trying to make it hard as they can for you.
Yeah.
To
Right.
be
And
Indian.
it's another barrier because with that registration card, you get certain services, you get certain perks, like scholarships and things like that. And if you don't have it and your family doesn't have it, then you don't get these things. So, I mean, there's pros and cons to it, but, my family felt it was better not to get that.
A lot of Native people have done very well for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of poverty, of course, but a lot of Native people, especially up in this region, have done very well for themselves. And it does come down to, when I was coming up, I was always taught, that I was Indian, I was of Indian descent, but they said, don't get political about it because you'll probably end up in jail.
Yeah, my family we do just fine by ourselves. We don't need the government's help for anything.
Right.
Can you say or tell us what you want the next generation to hear and do? What do you want to pass down to the next generation? There's a couple of different generations sitting up there. What would you like to pass down to the folks that come after you?
Pride in themselves, practice and usage. You could talk about being Indian or Indigenous all day, but if you don't do things in your everyday life that reminds you of that, it's like in Indigenous culture, there's no word for religion. Spirituality, yes. Religion, no. And spirituality is part of it is just being aware of, the cycles of the moon. The sunrise, knowing when watching that sun come up. I'm lucky the way my house is built. I can watch the sun come up from my bed. It's wonderful, but it's important. And that at night, praying at night at sunset, and keep it like, for instance, the shortest day of the year is literally speaking is December 21st, but by December 10th, the sunsets start happening a little bit later. But it's weird how that is. We don't pay attention to those kinds of things. Those little things. That's what because there's a lot of drug addiction. There's a lot of shame about who they are and confusion about, am I black, am I white, am I Puerto Rican? It's all these crazy things in people's heads. And for our youth, I want to pass on, just be proud of who you are. That's all.
Yep. I feel like the same thing, like with like a lot of kids nowadays. I kind of like it has gotten better with like kids being proud in who they are, but like sometimes like in my school, like we had a Native American like club, but like it kind of died out ish, cuz like kids, they didn't really speak up much about like being Native American and like their tribes or whatever, because like I knew that there were some kids that were, but like not a lot of kids like talking about it or like talking about who they are. And sometimes I find that difficult for myself too, sometimes, like trying to speak up, because like I might be like the only Native in the room sometimes, most of the time, but yeah, it can be hard. But
I think it's hard too when you stand out too much. So when I was in school, it was either you were Hispanic or you were white, and there was very little other. And so you were either one or the other, and if you weren't, you stood out. And so a lot of people in my generation wanted to be as invisible as possible while going through school, because not being invisible led to possible racism and bullying incidents. And now I'm older and I really don't care what people think about me, so I can do whatever I like. But at the time, you know, I was just trying to get through school and as easily as possible without problems, I think.
yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, like it's hard standing out, like,
Right.
but I've been trying to embrace it.
That's great.
I always say to make your presence known, because I kind of alluded to it earlier, but at one point in my life it was just easier to blend in and not really show it. And I wish I would have shown it so much more now that I, am this proud of it. I think I've always been proud of it, but I wasn't necessarily willing to embrace it as much. And thinking about how, like, I get asked to do a lot of things, give talks, and at the time I might be like, but I always think about when I was a little girl in the back of the classroom and there was no one Native at the front. And I always think about how I want to be that representation for the next generation so that they know they are capable of doing it as well. I just think always about who's in the room. You never know, but it could be a younger version of Sage who needs to see us at the front. My other thing would be to enter spaces. A lot of my work, most of my work is in education. Enter spaces that weren't necessarily built for us. We need more Native professors, doctors, lawyers. We need them, and so I think, if I can do it, if I can go to college, so can the next generation. But just having those role models and people to look up to and seeing, it's awesome seeing the generations above me doing such cool things, because it shows me I'm capable. So I think if we can do that for the next generation, that would be like the best thing.
Yeah.
Like, I was gonna say that I agree with that, like looking up to like elders or like my aunties or uncles, like looking to them and like seeing like how they like they don't care that they stand out, they just kind of do it. Like that's helped me in like my identity a lot, because like it makes me feel like I can do the same.
Yeah. So I would say that while you're getting that courage, while you're young and you're getting that, because everyone wants to fit in when they're little, right? So while you're getting that courage when you're young, and people are trying to tell you things, you said this really nice thing in the very beginning, that one of the things about being Native is listening to your elders. And that's so true, that we listen and we hear the coolest things. We hear things from our grandmas, our aunties, our moms and dads. And I think that collecting those stories and just being the story keeper, of those, and then just remembering to maintain your curiosity about all of that, go back, ask questions, try to tell it again, see if you get it wrong, get it down again. And I do this with my aunties still today. I do this with my grandma still today, just to make sure that, am I getting all the stories right? Am I getting all the details right? I always get something wrong. And I'm never saying the words right or whatever. But
as soon as you learn it, you got to practice it.
You have to practice and ask them, and is this exactly how it goes, or why it's happening? And And so I would just encourage them to just continue to collect the stories and listen. Just listen when you're young. And then when you're older, you can get the courage and share and dig in a little bit more. But what it reminded me of is also is when I went to Yale for grad school. And when I got into Yale and I told my grandma, and she had gone to Indian residential school and then, didn't get a GED because she ran away from and it never occurred to me why my grandma didn't have a high school diploma, and it sort of all came together later that she had gone to get her GED, et cetera. And she said, when I was going to Yale, she said to me, I always thought I was smart enough that I could have gone to a school like that. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, yeah, my grandma's so smart. She's 92. She's still all there. She's whip smart. And I said, well, yeah, Grandma, I think you probably could have gone to Yale. And she said, well, now that you're there, it told me I could have. Yeah, it told me I could have.
I think it's important for us to encourage our children as Native Americans to go to college and pursue higher education, because less than 1% of Native Americans actually make it into higher ed.
Let alone in 4 years.
Let alone finishing 4 years of higher ed or getting a post-secondary degree, like a graduate or doctoral degree. That's very rare. So, encouraging them as much as possible to try to at least attempt college and to get a degree.
Yeah.
And get a skill, whether it's dancing, doing art, carpentry, get a skill.
Right.
To me, that's equally important.
Right.
You were talking about the reverence paid to elders, and the older I get, the more I like that.
Yeah, respect of our elders is probably the
you
number
want to become
thing.
more and more Indigenous.
I was wondering if your tribe allows adoption.
Bevin's does.
Yeah, I think in my family, my grandparents and my parents always reinforced that respect of your elders is like the number one thing. You never disrespect your elders. You may not always agree with them, but you still respect them and speak in a way that is respectful and acknowledge who they are and where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm. And in my tribe, we even take it further. Kind of, I think it was you were talking about the animals earlier in Mother Earth. And my grandfather always said when, somebody in our community passes, Mother Earth brings them back as the soil that we walk on, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the deer on the riverbank. Those are our ancestors, and that's where that's just another layer of where that respect comes from. I meant to say something about that earlier.
Well, unless somebody has some final thoughts that they'd like the community to know, I could see from Adrian that we've
used up our time.
Yeah. Any final thoughts?
Well, what I would say to people, especially young people, organize. Like in Hartford, we're organizing. The last 3 or 4 years, we've been doing a Native Harvest Festival. And, we haven't gotten big enough to be a powwow yet, but people have to organize because it really gets down to, if you can't at least once a year, it's sometime to, just gather everybody together and just be proud to be Native. Because that's what's going to make an impression on kids. Like you said, you go into powwows, that makes an impression. A lot of times, there weren't that many powwows around here when I was a kid. But I know that, and I see how the effect of that is. It's practice and usage. Practice and usage. Can't say it enough.
The last thing I'll say is just look at how different we all look, too. That was something I struggled with forever, is the stereotypes. You don't fit the, you don't have the darkest skin, your hair could be a little longer. I've pretty much always had long hair, but stuff like that. And I always, at one point in my life, it came down to, should I wear bigger beaded earrings? Should I wear more beadwork? And especially when I speak to young kids now, I try to go in as plain as I can be, just to show them I can look like you, I can look like the person sitting next to me. Whatever I look like, it doesn't make me any less Indigenous. And I feel like that's always so absent from the conversation. Is I say, oh, I'm Penobscot to somebody, and they look at me like I get the up and down, like, really? I'm like, better believe it. But just look at how different we look, right? And that's so cool.
We're obsessed with race in this country. It's obsessive. That's what the cause of all of that.
Well, on behalf of the town of West Hartford, I want to thank all of you for sharing your time and knowledge with us, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. I think the camera's off, but that was so beautiful. And thank you for taking the time to be out here and